Now, empires have long been a prominent feature of world history, and historians pay a lot of attention to them. So I just want to skip through quickly a number of the older empires, and then we will focus in a little more carefully on empires of the last 500 years or so. So there is the Persian Empire, the Roman, they were neighbors and rivals. The Chinese were developing an empire about the same time as the Romans were creating theirs. There was, much later, an empire in West Africa. The Mongols created what was then the world's largest empire across much of Eurasia. The Incas created a huge empire running up and down the west coast of South America. The Ottoman Empire, at least in 1638, encompassed much of the Mediterranean world and the Middle East. And the Russians created an empire stretching all across Eurasia. Now, here's the question. Why have historians and ordinary people like ourselves become so interested in empires? What is the lure of empire? Let me suggest a couple of things. One is that empires were big. They were constructed. They constructed cities, monuments, aqueducts. Here is the Roman aqueduct. They did great roads. The Chinese built a great wall. So they were important, and we think of them because they were so big. They were also bloody, and somehow we are fascinated by the violence of empire. You may remember that poor Alexander wept when there were no more worlds to conquer. Poor fellow. We are aware of the brutality of the Mongols. This is an image from the Mongol conquest of Russia. The Aztec Empire was noted for its human sacrifices. So there is the fascination of violence. But empires are fascinating not only in their construction, but in their destruction. We are fascinated by Samsons who fall, by the decline of the great. Why did such huge structures fall apart from time to time? There are, of course, philosophical lessons in all of this about impermanence, and there are often political lessons about why empires fell. There was a book a few years ago called Are We Rome? About the collapse of the Roman Empire and the lessons that that holds for Western civilization. And finally, empires have been of great interest to historians and other people simply because they were consequential. They had an impact. The legacy of empires are often deeply woven into contemporary societies. Western civilization, of course, honors and celebrates Greek philosophy, Roman law, the Latin language, architecture and styles of governance. When Mao came to power in China in 1949, he immediately compared himself to Qin Shi Huangdi, who was the founder of the Chinese Empire many millennia before. In his mind, they both represented new beginnings for Chinese civilization. And finally, empires are important because they brought people, diverse peoples, distant peoples, into contact with each other. And in doing so, they fostered economic and cultural interaction and exchange. The Mongol Empire, of course, transmitted the plague, the Black Death, from China to Europe. The Roman Empire is known as the Pax Romana. It brought peace to a very large chunk of the Mediterranean world for about 4 centuries. But now I would like to turn to a different kind of empire in a little bit more detail. And here I'm speaking about European empires in the Americas from roughly 1500 to 1800. These were the products of the Spanish and Portuguese in South America and the Caribbean. Brazil was Portuguese, much of the Caribbean and the rest of Latin America was Spanish. The British, French, and the Dutch competed for pieces of North America. This was a different kind of empire, and it was different in a number of ways. In the first place, this was an overseas empire. All of the previous empires that I showed you were empires of contiguous territory. They were not separated. The homeland of empire and the empire itself were contiguous territories. Not so in these American empires of Europe. And this made a difference. It made control more difficult. It had to be exercised across the Atlantic Ocean. It made the cultural differences more stark and sharp. And it meant that the Europeans who were creating these empires were moving into territories of which they were almost totally unaware. A second unique feature about these European empires lay in the enormity of the demographic impact. Some combination of disease, violence, and racism produced a massive, really a catastrophic, almost genocidal loss of population. The population of the Caribbean islands had almost entirely vanished 50 years after Columbus arrived. The population of Mexico by 1650 or so had dropped by about 90%. And something similar happened in Dutch and British North America. Governor Bradley of the Plymouth colony said this: "The good hand of God was at work, sweeping away great multitudes of the natives so that he might make room for us." Nothing like this, except perhaps in the Mongol Empire, occurred in these Asian empires that we have just reviewed. A third distinctive feature of these empires was massive colonization. Hundreds of thousands of European settlers moved into the New World, Spanish, Portuguese, British, and French, all of which allowed for or enabled the creation of what have sometimes been called neo-European societies in the Americas. These were societies in which Europeans could enjoy a diet with which they were familiar and cultural patterns with which they were familiar. A fourth distinctive feature of these empires lay in the creation of a zone of interaction across the Atlantic between Europe, Africa, North and South America. That was unprecedented in world history. That had never happened before. Now there was an interacting Atlantic world. It found expression in what is called the Columbian Exchange, the massive exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and people back and forth across the Atlantic. And this shows some of the plants and animals that moved both ways in this enormous pattern of exchange and interaction. Another expression of this is slavery and the slave trade. European colonization of the Americas gave rise to the largest expansion of slavery since the end of the Roman Empire. the smaller insert map here shows where the slaves came from and where they mostly wound up. I used to ask my students what what percentage of the slaves that came to the Americas wound up in what was becoming the United States. And most of them said half or more. Actually, it is about
9.
Hmm?
9.
9?
90.
90. No,
Oh,
no. About 5% or less.
Only?
Yes. Yes. The vast majority of the slaves went either to the Caribbean or to Brazil. What was becoming the United States was responsible for a very small percentage of the slaves. The slave trade and the presence of large numbers of Africans in the Americas resulted in racially based social systems that were also new. In much of Latin America, the racial mixtures generated a whole slew of categories of mixed race people that are reflected in this slide. It's known as the Costa system. And there were, at least in this one, 4 times 16 separate categories, recognized categories of people, depending on the precise mixture of Native American, African, and European heritage. In North America, it was a little different. We never had this kind of many different categories. It was a sharp divide. You were black or you were white, and there was not much else. And finally, there was an enormous amount of cultural mixing that was going on here. There were new languages developed, such as Creole. In Louisiana, there was new cuisine, there was new music, there was new religion. Voodoo took shape in Haiti, candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba. These were religious traditions that mixed European Catholic ideas with various African religious elements. So these European empires in the Americas were enormously consequential. And that continued in the 19th century, in what I'm calling the empires of the industrial era. And there were at least 5 reasonably separate expressions of this empire building process. One of them was colonialism in Asia. India was taken over by the British, Southeast Asia by the French, Indonesia by the Dutch. Later on, the Japanese got an empire in Korea and Taiwan. One of the most dramatic expressions of this new industrial era imperialism lay in what is called the scramble for Africa. Between about 1875 and 1900, a half a dozen European powers simply descended upon Africa and divided it up among themselves. It's interesting that this process did not lead to war among the Europeans. It came close on a couple of occasions, but it never led to outright conflict, military conflict between the European powers. Of course, it led to an enormous amount of war on the ground to make their rule effective, but they managed to divide things up more or less peacefully. This is a famous cartoon of Cecil Rhodes. The British were proud that they had an empire that ran from Cairo to the Cape. And this famous cartoon shows Cecil Rhodes with 1 foot in Egypt and the other foot in South Africa, bestriding this long stretch of British territory that went from Egypt to South Africa. Another part of the world that was affected by this is what we call Oceania. Australia and New Zealand became British territories with a large number of European settlers. The islands of the Pacific there in Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia were taken over by various European powers and some from the United States as well. And with the exception of Hawaii, they did not have so many European settlers. The fourth expression of this industrial age imperialism was the westward expansion of the United States. We bought Florida from the Spanish, the Louisiana Purchase from France. The British gave up the Northwest, and we took Texas and this so-called Mexican cession by war from Mexico. And that too was a part of this industrial era empire building. And also the Russians were involved. The Russians had been established in Alaska for some time, and during the 19th century, they extended their control down to roughly what is now Fort Ross. And you've probably seen that. Now, all of this was deeply conditioned by Europe's Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created needs for raw materials, which Europeans found in their new empires. It also created the need for markets. Europeans were producing more than their own home population could afford to buy. So in order to keep the factories running, they needed to find markets abroad, and the colonies provided that. What made it possible was the amazing industrial era expansion of European military power. There was a saying that was common: whatever happens, we have got the Gatling gun and they have not. So this differential in military power meant that during the 19th century, Europeans simply had a degree of military power that was not equal anywhere in the world. Now, all of this had an impact on Europe itself, particularly in Europe's understanding of itself. This military and economic superiority convinced Europeans that their society was superior, and that superiority was expressed in racial terms. In 1850, a fellow named Robert Knox gave this a kind of a classic expression. He said, "Race is everything. Civilization depends on it." Race is everything. Civilization depends on it. And so this gave rise to a new kind of racism that historians refer to as pseudo-scientific racism. Racism that was backed up not simply by prejudice, but allegedly by the findings of modern science. The science known as phrenology, the study of skulls and so forth, was mobilized to explain why Europeans had this capacity and other people did not. And the Industrial Revolution made it possible for European colonialism to have a far deeper impact in the colonies than earlier empires had done. In the first place, it meant that conquest was more destructive. European weaponry was such that they could simply march in, and take over, not everywhere, but in a lot of places. There was a young British soldier named Richard Meinertzhagen who took part in campaigns in East Africa, and this is what he wrote about one single expedition against a small village in what is now Kenya. He wrote this: "Every soul was either shot or bayoneted. We burned the huts and razed the banana plantations to the ground." That happened over and over and over again as the British and the French and Germans sought to make their rule effective. The violence was such that historians claim that the first genocide of the 20th century occurred in German Southwest Africa, what is today Namibia. After the Germans established their control there, there was a rebellion by several of the peoples of the colony. And the Germans went in and just massacred tens of thousands of people and virtually eliminated those groups of people. In fact, in the last decade or so, the Germans have been in negotiation with the government of Namibia to acknowledge this and to offer some measure of reparations for what happened there in the early 20th century. Furthermore, the ways of living, and especially the ways of working, were very much impacted by the colonial system. In the first place, they imposed forced labor in many places. People were required to go out and work on the roads, to undertake construction programs. During the First World War, thousands of East Africans were recruited as what they called carriers to defend British territory. Furthermore, the Industrial Revolution, in its colonial expression, brought many peoples into the world economy for the first time. Now, many peoples were producing not just for their own sustenance, but they were producing for the world market. They were producing cotton, cocoa, rice, and all kinds of other things. Wage labor also became a prominent feature in many of the colonies. People were recruited or sometimes volunteered to work in mines, plantation, construction projects, and that set in motion a vast movement of people all over the world as they moved to find these jobs. And culturally as well, there was massive transformation as European education and the coming of Christianity transformed the lives of millions of people. Now, the 20th century witnessed the end of many empires. The Austrian, German, and Ottoman empires were ended after World War I. The German and Japanese empires were ended after World War II. The end of European empires in Africa gave rise to some 54 new independent states during roughly from the 1950s through the 1970s. And that is the new map of Africa that resulted from these independent movements. Furthermore, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that represented the end of the old Russian Empire. So that by the end of the 20th century, nation states had largely replaced empires as the major form of governance in the world as a whole. Now, in some ways, this was not new. Earlier empires had collapsed, so that simply the collapse of empire was not entirely novel. What was new, however, is that what accompanied the collapse of empire in the 20th century was the discrediting of the idea of empire. Empire lost its moral legitimacy in the 20th century. Imperialism became a dirty word. You know, in 1900, many people were proud to be called imperialists, and the British celebrated their empire. But by the end of the 20th century, few people wanted to think of themselves as imperialists. Imperialism had become a dirty word. The United Nations had become a forum for anti-imperialist, anti-colonial movements. In 1960, there was a declaration on independence for colonial countries that defined foreign rule as a denial of human rights. So the United Nations acted to end the legitimacy of empire. And so it's an interesting question as to what was responsible for this radical change. This is the first time in world history that empire had lost its moral legitimacy. And I think several things contribute to this. One was the world wars and the Holocaust, of course, meant a serious dent was put into any idea of European superiority. How could Europeans claim moral superiority, the right to rule these countries, when they had inflicted on their own continent, on their own countries, this kind of enormous devastation? Another thing that contributed to this loss of legitimacy was a growing awareness of a contradiction between fundamental European values and the practice of empire. Even Europeans became to feel uneasy with empire. How could they claim to be fighting for self-determination in World War II when they were denying self-determination to their colonies? How could they claim to be democratic societies when the colonies were dictatorships, not democracies? Furthermore, the new communist powers, the Soviet Union and China in particular, came to power with an anti-colonial ideology. To them, colonialism was a product of capitalism. And the United States also, because of its own anti-colonial history, was not willing to back up the European colonial powers when they got in trouble. Except for a while, we did it in Vietnam too, which had, of course, a disastrous outcome. But the main thing that drove the end of empire was the growth of nationalist movements all over the colonial world. And I'm representing that with this image of Gandhi and his followers marching to independence in 1947. These nationalist movements essentially used European value systems to criticize colonialism. If Europeans wanted them to be democratic, then they had to give them independence. If Europeans believed in self-determination, then how could they continue with colonial rule? So by the end of the 20th century, in a way, empire seemed to be over. Empire seemed to have lost its legitimacy and lost its hold on ways of governance in the world. Or did it? Because accompanying the end of empire was also the persistence of empire, perhaps in other forms. We might consider what you could call Cold War empires. During the Cold War, the behavior of the United States and the Soviet Union have often been described as imperial, even as they condemned the older kind of territorial empire. what we might call the American empire was rooted in its economic dominance at the end of World War II. It was rooted in its leadership of NATO, in the penetration, in the economic penetration of multinational corporations, in its enormous military power, its global network of military bases, and of course, its frequent intervention, military and diplomatic intervention in Brazil, in Korea, in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Chile, Guatemala, Cuba, and elsewhere, and Iran. I was a minor part of the establishment of this American empire. I was a member of the Peace Corps. I was sent to Ethiopia. We were to be ambassadors for the American way of life. It so happened that the place where I lived backed up against the Russian embassy in Ethiopia. There was a big stone wall. We called it our Iron Curtain. And if we climbed up on the wall, we could watch the Russians playing volleyball on the other side. So it was, but the Peace Corps clearly was a peaceful way, an exercise of American soft power. The Soviet Empire was rooted, of course, in the Warsaw Pact, which confirmed Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Like the Americans, the Soviets gave economic and military aid to places that were sort of on their side in the Cold War. They too intervened militarily in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, in Poland, in Cuba, in Afghanistan. And of course, they, like us, tried to promote their own values. In their case, it was the values of socialism and anti-colonialism.
That's something that I stopped.
The other thing that has occurred is that the terms empire and imperialism took on a number of new meanings. Economic imperialism became sometimes called neo-colonialism, became an article of faith among many historians. It referred to the ability of rich countries to gain advantage over poorer ones by leveraging their economic power without political control and without the overt use of force. There was also what we now commonly refer to as cultural imperialism, which refers, of course, to the domination of foreign cultural patterns. We speak about Americanization. American movies, foods, blue jeans, and other miniskirts, and other American fashions were widely popular in other parts of the world. Barbie dolls became very popular even in the Islamic world. Sometimes we also speak of religious imperialism, by which we refer to the decline of local religions as Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism found more converts and sort of pushed out the many local indigenous religions that had previously flourished. So what I'm suggesting here is that although empire of the old kind was out the window, empire and imperialism got new expressions. They no longer required the political use of force, but they were rooted in some inequality of power. And the idea of empire came to refer to almost any expression of this inequality of power and influence in the world, whether or not it involved violence and outright political control. And a final interesting feature of empire in the post-war world is something that we might call imperial nostalgia, in which Well, let me just give you a couple of examples. Turkey, for example, under Erdogan, has sought a dominant position in the Middle East that is paralleled by a great interest in the Ottoman Empire. Many people have said that what Erdogan is doing is trying to reassemble something of the Ottoman Empire, in which Turkey, modern Turkey, plays a central role. The Chinese effort to control Tibet and the Uyghurs has something in common with that. Russia under Putin, of course, is an example of an attempt to recreate something of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire. Putin once said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, and he has set out to reverse it. A different kind of imperial nostalgia can be found in the homeland of the European colonies themselves. Polls have found that something like 30% of the British and 50% of the Dutch were more proud than ashamed of their empires. A famous British historian named Niall Ferguson has made the case most dramatically, I guess. He argued that colonial rule was better than what it had replaced. And here's a quote from Ferguson. "It is hard to make the case that somehow the world would have been better off if the Europeans had stayed at home." I suppose that the victims of colonial rule might take exception to that. So in conclusion, I'd just like to raise two questions about empire. One is, why do we celebrate it? Why is Alexander called the Great rather than the Horrible? A year or so ago, Suzanne and I went to an exhibit at the what museum was that?
Not the Dion, the Legion of Honor.
Right. And there was an exhibit about the kingdom of Ramses. Ramses was an Egyptian empire builder. And what surprised me was, in this age of anti-imperialism, where most museum exhibits are pretty critical, Ramses was celebrated for creating an Egyptian empire, violently, no less. So that's one question. Why do we celebrate empire? And perhaps even more significant than celebrating it is, why do we keep doing it? Why do we keep doing it? Why has empire of one kind or another persisted for so long, in spite of the massive violence and oppression that they have generated? I'm not sure that the answers lie entirely in history. I think sometimes that they may have more to do with psychology, maybe even religious outlooks. Is there something about human nature that gives us an impulse to dominate, an impulse to power? Is that intrinsic to humankind? Is it a kind of original sin that besets all of us from the get-go? Or is it simply the expression of inequalities of power? Does inequality of power provide a temptation to make use of that inequality to one's own advantage? And that is rarely resisted. On the other hand, one might argue that empire has often been defensive. Once you start building an empire, then the question is, where do you stop? When the Romans were creating their empire over a number of centuries, they found themselves with insecure frontiers, which meant that they had to conquer a little bit more to ease their security. But then their insecurity surfaced again, and they had to keep going. The American empire, of course, in the 19th century kept going until it met the ocean.
Perfect.
Yes.
Into the world.
Another possible explanation is tribal thinking. Are we by nature tribal in our outlook? This in-group and out-group thinking, is there anything that can counteract that? Or is it a matter of opportunity? I have wondered if the Navajo had invented gunpowder or nuclear weapons, would things have been any different than if the Europeans invented them, or the Chinese in this case?
Or the smallpox vaccine,
I'm sorry?
or the smallpox vaccine.
Or the smallpox vaccine, yes, yes. So I have no clear answers to this question about why empire persists. But as I was preparing this little talk, the question seemed to arise. And I would invite any of your commentaries on it. So let me stop here and see if you have comments, questions.
Well, you listed about 4 or 5 reasons why we still admire empire, but they're not mutually exclusive.
No?
I mean, probably all of them should.
Yes, yes.
There is another one expressed in the book, the territorial imperative. You're familiar with that.
Yes, yes.
Okay, well, I appreciate these insights you have. Let me suggest something new, though. We are in a unique situation in the sense that one way or another, there will be one world empire. And it will not be unipolar. And the struggle now is between these unipolar states, or many empires.
Yeah.
And it's a very dangerous situation, but my prediction is there's no way to avoid this struggle. Someone will win.
But will it be global?
Yes.
Can you imagine a global system that exercises power over the entire world without competition among different centers of power?
Well, we have a federal government, and we also have state government,
Okay.
so it's analogous to where we have the European Union and so on. It'd be a matter of a larger system.
Or a
And-
global federation?
Well, but also I'm suggesting it can be arrived at through the monopoly of force. As you have suggested was the case in all these other empires.
Okay.
And this is the way unfortunate, but I think that is what will happen.
Good afternoon. Corporate empires, the influence of their power, their force, their armies, the corporations, their influence, their fear of influence, they're taking over their cultural identities that come with it, their values, their supporting of democracies are in support of them, how they wield power and a corporate influence.
Sure, sure. I think that's at the heart of what people refer to as economic imperialism.
Right.
Especially the big multinational corporations. Yeah.
Mickey D's culture. McDonald's culture,
Yeah,
Disneyland
yeah.
culture.
I think the big question for me is whether we can have some kind of awakening or some kind of higher consciousness about this whole thing, because all of this is predicated on will to power and domination and using other people. But there is another way to be in the world, to be more related and caring and to think about the impact of colonialism on the poor African who's oppressed. And could we actually, transform in that way? I mean, that's to be determined, but we're at some kind of crossroads here. We're giving.
How much money would you want to put on that?
My hope is that something can change, and I probably won't live to see that.
There are examples of places that did refuse empire. the Chinese, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to talk about this, but the Chinese had the opportunity in the 1400s to create a maritime empire in the Indian Ocean. Their ships went all over it. They were unrivaled in their power, but they turned away from it. They burned their fleets. They destroyed the records of those fleets, and they.
Whose idea was that? Whose idea was that?
Well, I'll say more about that. It was the Chinese bureaucracy that saw the danger coming from the north. The Mongols or their descendants coming in, and they thought that this messing around in the Indian Ocean was a distraction.
That's not a denial of empire. That's simply recognizing what was most important to them.
Okay. And to back up your point, the Chinese, a century or so after that, went on an empire building process in Inner Asia, in which they took over Tibet, Manchuria, and the what is now Xinjiang. So Chinese may have rejected a maritime empire in the Indian Ocean, but they created a territorial empire in Inner Asia.
And the question that I always had is, we're competitive instinctively. Can we have competition in all these world cultures without violence? Can we not have it? I mean, it doesn't have to be a football game, it can be a basketball game. I mean, there's a way of expressing competition without violence. And I don't think the world, with the world of weapons and of power, quite grasps it.
And football replaced war.
Yeah.
Well, it is, it's sublimated, it's sublimating,
Okay,
that, but it's not enough, we don't have enough football teams. Everybody should be on the team.
yes.
So it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, one way empires form is to fill a void. So in case of America, there was sort of a void and imperialists came here and created empires. Would you say that's fair?
Well, empires generally conquer other peoples who are there. From their point of view, there was no void.
Yes.
They were there. Now, they were unable to resist. I mean, the Native American society simply did not have the technology, or maybe even the organizational capacity to resist this flux of Europeans that were sweeping across the North American continent. But the notion that there was a void I mean, that is an argument that the imperialists generally made. When the Europeans went to Australia, for example, what they found was very simple hunting and gathering societies. And to them, this was a void because they were not making productive use of the land.
That's sort of what I meant, a void from their perspective. But
Yes.
Existed or not.
Yes.
So they saw open land.
That's right. And they saw peoples that were not making the most of the land that they had from the imperial point of view.
So can I ask, maybe this is obscure, but maybe we can use these to project into the future. Suppose we have space travel and we go to a new planet. What do those empires look like then? Let me draw a bit of analogy there. What will happen if we want to colonize Mars? The empires.
Well, there's already some rivalry on that. Yeah.
The term void, this brings up exploitation, and just because it's not, a booming, metropolis of factories doesn't mean it's a void. The void that wasn't seen, it was where's the spiritual, paradise. And your instinct is.
I wasn't arguing that it was.
No, but I mean, it's the term void,
Oh, yeah,
Yeah. Seeing void is something you have to go
yeah.
take over, well.
Is Israel starting a new empire by conquering Palestine?
Well, from a Palestinian point of view, yes. I think the Israelis have often, well, when Israel was established, there were images that showed a more or less empty land that the Zionists were coming to make more productive. And it's certainly possible to argue that they saw a void, or at least land that was not being effectively used. And of course, they had ancient roots in that part of the world. And so
I was just gonna say, this gives me a new perspective on the Ukrainian war. Why is Putin so persistent, you know, it's Russian Empire, it's motivating him
of
to.
course, he thinks that Ukraine is not a nation, that they are at heart little Russians.
I don't see Ukraine on the map, or am I missing it?
It's there,
Well,
it's not-
At this point, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union,
Oh, okay.
so it was, this is a map of Europe in 1960,
Oh,
and
I
there
see.
was no independent Ukraine in 1960.
Okay, I see you 1969.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the overlying question is, can we learn to respect another people's point of view, you know? I mean, from Putin's point of view, the Ukrainians don't exist, they're part of Russia, but from the Ukrainian point of view, you know, they want their own country. Yeah. So can we learn to get along, you know?
And
Doesn't look good.
if they didn't feel that they had their own country before the invasion, they certainly do now. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, delighted to be with you. We'll next Saturday, we'll take up globalization then and now. So that's.